On February 24th of 2022, Russian troops invaded Ukraine, triggering a war that continues to this day. The Russian war in Ukraine has resulted in countless deaths and forced millions of people to seek asylum outside of Ukraine's borders. There is widespread belief among scholars and analysts that the conflict will fundamentally reshape global relations, or at least accelerate processes already underway. In policy circles and mainstream media in the United States and Europe, the debates have largely focused on the perspectives emanating from the U.S. national security establishment. These perspectives themselves largely echo and accept with little skepticism U.S. military doctrine enshrined in the U.S. National Defense Strategy of 2018, which identifies great power competition or geopolitical contestation between the U.S., China, and Russia as the overarching strategic consideration of this time. The official response of Western countries, consisting of political and diplomatic isolation of Russia and economic warfare against it, while providing billions of dollars of financial assistance and weapons to Ukraine, has often been portrayed as the only solution to the conflict. Russian official responses, in turn, have justified the invasion in various ways, and see the Western response as, at the very least, hypocritical, given the legacy of Western interventionism, as well as a proof of long-standing plans to destroy Russia. However, outside these narratives, there's another world, the countries of the Global South in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, who are increasingly rejecting the binary narratives emanating from the West, and potentially from Russia and China. In some ways, these views, be they of citizens and movements in the Global South, or even official government responses, do not accept either the official narratives of the war, nor are they willing to sign up to a campaign dictated by the West. In this episode, we investigate why this is the case. In particular, we view the Russian war in Ukraine from a Global South perspective by analyzing the effects of the crisis on Global South countries. We discuss the differences and similarities in the response to the conflict across and within the regions of the Global South, and highlight the issues that are currently missing from the mainstream discussion.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too.
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
Welcome to Security in Context, a podcast aimed at promoting new thinking on security from a global perspective. I'm your host, Anita Fuentes, and today's podcast will explore the Russian war in Ukraine from the perspective of the Global South. For this episode, I interviewed a political analyst and 3 scholars specialized in different regions of the Global South. They are Eric Draitser, an independent political analyst and host of CounterPunch Radio.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Samar Al-Bulushi, assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine.
It's good to be here with you.
Noha Aboueldahab, assistant professor of international law and transitional justice at Georgetown University, Qatar, and non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Arlene Tickner, professor of international relations at the School of International, Political, and Urban Studies at Universidad del Rosario Bogotá, and the co-director of the Colombian Observatory of Organized Crime.
Thank you, Anita.
Our first guest is Eric Draitser, an independent political analyst and the host and producer of the CounterPunch Radio podcast. CounterPunch is an independent online magazine, radio, and publishing house aimed at covering politics from a left-leaning perspective. Since the war began, Eric has been thoroughly dissecting the conflict in his podcasts and YouTube videos, covering more general issues such as the causes behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the information war, or the effects of this conflict on international affairs, as well as more nuanced issues that have been brought to light because of the newfound focus on this conflict. Given his extensive knowledge on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I asked Eric to give us a brief overview of the historical, economic, and political causes of Russia's war in Ukraine.
Just to address one aspect of it, we could see that the war, Russia's war in Ukraine, is essentially a continuation of a number of unresolved conflicts stemming from the toppling of the former Ukrainian government in 2014, the Euromaidan uprising, and the outbreak of the war in Donbass in 2014. Many of those conflicts, which remained unresolved, have led us to 8 years later to this war. But of course, we can also look at it from an even longer historical lens and say that many of these conflicts have remained unresolved since 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where Ukraine was an integral part of the Soviet Union. It featured quite heavily in terms of economic development, economic output, GDP, all of the normal economic indicators. Ukraine was a central part of the Soviet Union in that regard, and Ukraine never recovered really since 1991 in terms of its GDP. It's one of the only, I think it's the only former Soviet republic that did not recover to its pre-1991 GDP level. So there are economic factors, unresolved economic conflicts in Ukraine that, of course, gave rise to the class of people that we know as oligarchs today, both in Russia and in Ukraine. Many of those inter conflicts between those oligarchs also figure quite heavily in this war. And then, of course, it's not entirely Russia and Ukraine. NATO and the United States and the European powers since 1991 have also helped to create the conditions for this conflict, both with regard to NATO's expansion and more broadly with the economic policies and foreign policy that have been pursued since that time. So to take the broadest perspective on it, you could say that the war between Russia and Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in many ways the culmination of a series of unresolved conflicts that really, I think, have all come to the fore in 2022 as the global economic situation has changed, coronavirus, supply chains, all of these things have brought us to a moment of crisis, and Russia, for various reasons that we could get into, chose this time to essentially resolve, from its perspective, resolve these unresolved conflicts. Now, if we want to look at some of these economic motivations, they really do form some of the basis of how we need to understand this conflict. I already mentioned the oligarchs. I think the oligarchs play a major role. And when I say the oligarchs, I mean oligarchs as a class of individuals, a class that exists both in Ukraine and in Russia, Ukrainian oligarchs and Russian oligarchs. At times, they have worked at cross purposes. At times, they have aligned with each other. At times, they have fought against each other. And we've seen throughout this conflict some of the economic motivations as being rooted in some of these power struggles. You have people like Kolomoisky and Firtash and Akhmetov, who are infamous oligarchs in Ukraine who have essentially monopolized the economy of Ukraine in the last 30 years and essentially have run the country as essentially an oligarchy. Similarly, in Russia, you have an entire class of oligarchs that are basically orbiting around Vladimir Putin. Many of them regard the Ukrainian oligarchs as both rivals and also as problematic sort of troublemakers, right? People who are horning in on some of the Russian oligarchs' actions. So you see this in a lot of different contexts. You could take one example, gas pipeline infrastructure in Ukraine. That is controlled by Ukrainian oligarchs. Russians are very much dependent on that, or have been historically dependent on those pipelines to ship their energy to Europe. So one of the conflicts within this conflict is a conflict over that infrastructure, a conflict over who gets to control all of the infrastructure and the resources flowing from Russia and into Europe. That's one aspect of this. We can also talk about the various forms of corruption, the collapse of the Ukrainian economy in 1991. There was an so-called Orange Revolution in 2004, which brought a pro-Western government into Ukraine. That then swung in the other direction as it was succeeded by a pro-Russian government. And so this tug of war between the pro-Western forces in Ukraine and the pro-Russian forces in Ukraine had also kind of led us to this culminating conflict. And so again, I think we need to also keep in mind too, one other important economic factor here that is often ignored or under discussed is the role of agriculture and farmland. Ukraine has some of the most fertile farmland in the world. It is one of the main global exporters of wheat, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a minute. And the Russians, who are also a global leader in wheat exports, they also wanted to control that land, control those resources, control those exports, and control, in some degree, the global food supply. And in fact, we're seeing that beginning to play out in the global south, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. Russia also has political motives here. Russia really saw an opportunity to counter what it sees as an unending expansion of NATO all the way to its borders. That has been one of the principal talking points for the Kremlin, really from the very beginning of this conflict. But it also has a lot more to do also with controlling the former satellites, the former Soviet republics, not allowing the former republics of the Soviet Union to be turned into European and American partners that could be potentially seen from Moscow's perspective as being turned against Moscow. And then, of course, we also have to keep in mind that the United States figures really centrally in all of this as well, both in terms of what decision makers in Ukraine do, but also decision makers in Russia. I would argue that part of the rationale behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine had to do with U.S. politics and had to do with Biden versus Trump, what Putin saw as a moment of opportunity, a window of time where he might be able to act and predict how the U.S. might respond versus a much more unpredictable Trump administration.
But in order to understand Russia's motivations behind invading Ukraine, it's important to examine the ideological factors at play.
But we do also need to keep in mind that ideology figures into all of this as well. Ideas, the vision that people in Russia, Putin himself and others around him have of Russia's place in the world, that also figures centrally in a lot of their decision making. I would describe it as a form of imperial revanchism. They see themselves as the inheritors not of the Soviet Union, but of the Russian Empire. They see this as a form of neo-imperial conquest. And this really is important to understand because it's not simply trying to demonize the Russian government as imperialist, rather to say why they invaded Ukraine. Russian imperial revanchism doesn't see Ukraine as a real country. Russian imperial revanchism sees Ukraine as a part of Russia historically and today. They don't view Ukraine as either independent or view Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian people as somehow separate from them. So this is part of the reason why under the Russian imperial system and also under the Soviet Union, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian customs, these were all suppressed. This is also part of the reason why when Vladimir Putin announced the invasion of Ukraine back in February, he made a boldly and blatantly anti-communist, anti-Lenin, anti-Soviet speech, where he essentially described Ukraine as a ticking time bomb created by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and essentially that Putin is the inheritor of that, and that he is the one to resolve that unresolved conflict of 105 years ago. So, in essence, what we see with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is also Russia extending this kind of revanchist ideology, an imperial revanchist ideology, into what it views as its traditional sphere of influence, those that it views as part of Russia. And this plays into all of the other factors I was talking about earlier. The Russian oligarchs, they don't recognize Ukrainian oligarchs as their equals. They recognize the resources of Ukraine as belonging to Russia. So the economic and political and ideological factors sort of overlap and fold in on each other and create the situation that we see today.
On March 2nd, as the number of Ukrainian refugees fleeing Russia's invasion reached 1 million, the United Nations General Assembly approved a non-binding resolution condemning Russia for invading Ukraine and demanding that it withdraw its military forces. Out of the 193 members of the Assembly, 141 voted in favor, 35 abstained, and 5 voted against. On April 7th, the United Nations General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the organization's leading human rights body, amid allegations that its soldiers killed civilians while retreating from the region around Kyiv. The resolution received a 2/3 majority of those voting, with 93 nations voting in favor and 24 against. 58 countries, however, abstained from the process, including some of the biggest countries in the global south, like China, India, or Brazil. Despite the dominant narratives of there being widespread international support for the United Nations resolutions to punish and isolate Russia, little has been said about those which prefer to take a more neutral stance, either by refusing to pursue economic sanctions or by abstaining from expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council. The map of sanctions and the vote to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council reveals a rift between North and South. And only by analyzing the official reaction of the countries that refrained from taking sides in the conflict can we get a full understanding of the geopolitical consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine. Having walked us through the roots and drivers of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I asked Eric Draitser to comment on the official response of Global South countries to these solutions. Here's what he said.
States in the Global South are independent states. While there is a global imperial system, while there are major powers and countries fall into camps and all of that, ultimately these countries are independent and they have their own interests. They might be interests based on domestic political concerns. They might be interests based on economics or corruption or whatever. But they have their own interests. And so what you see in this context is a lot of countries in the Global South that see it in their interest not to take a side in this conflict, not because they necessarily agree with what Russia's doing or agree with Joe Biden or with the Europeans or whatever, but because they actually need to use this situation to their own advantage, to gain their own leverage in these situations. I think we have to remember that much of the world is also teetering on the brink of collapse itself. And it's looking to figure out ways to resolve a lot of these conflicts. And you have a lot of countries in the poorer parts of the world that they don't see some of the things coming out of the United States and Europe as being beneficial to them. They don't necessarily see getting away from gas as something that has to be done when they don't have the gas to cook food for their families. You understand? So the priorities in different parts of the world are vastly different than they are in the United States, where people, or in the West generally, where people will complain about paying a lot for gas, but not really thinking about, in much of the world, that's the difference between eating and not. And so for a lot of people who are viewing these issues from the outside, they're not that interested in, who is morally at fault. They don't want to hear moral arguments from Washington or from Paris or from London or Brussels, right? They also don't want to hear about, the need to teach the Russians a lesson when they themselves aren't sure if the wheat is going to be here in 2 months or not.
But what are the contrasts between how different regions in the Global South reacted to the conflict? And were there any outliers within these regions that decided not to take a neutral stance in their official response? Our guests Samar Al-Bulushi, Noha Aboueldahab, and Arlene Tickner helped us make sense of these questions by commenting on the official reaction of African, Middle Eastern, and Latin American countries to the conflict. Samar Al-Bulushi is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Her current work includes topics of surveillance, policing, and militarized urbanism in the context of the so-called War on Terror in East Africa. Her latest book, War Making as World Making, explores Kenya's entanglement in the ongoing war against the militant group Al-Shabaab. This is her take on the diplomatic response of African countries to the Russian war in Ukraine.
I think that a global South-oriented analysis of what transpired at the UN, both with the vote about removing Russia from the Human Rights Council and the vote to condemn at the time of the invasion, would necessitate that we simply sit down and think about what it means to occupy, a particular position of the world that is not, the dominant one, right? And to account for the fact that many of these states have developed relationships that are multi-oriented, right, multifaceted, and that are explicitly and deliberately so in the sense that they have to look out for their own interests, right? And so the first and foremost, I think, thing that I would foreground is the degree to which these actors are motivated by their own geopolitical strategies and concerns. Now, I would say that rather than there being an explicit that these votes represent an explicit articulation of support for Russia, the votes represent simply an articulation that, look, we have all kinds of interests that are at stake here and we have to take them into account. And so I think the US has been overemphasizing and overstating the degree to which African states are, collaborating or have been kind of pressured into unfair relationships with Russia. And I think we also have to account for the degree to which Libya and the removal of Gaddafi has had quite a significant impact on geopolitical relationships in Africa, and the degree to which leaders are willing to more publicly take on and challenge the West, for example. So, even though many of those states abstained, very few actually spoke out publicly one way or another in favor of one entity or another, the US or Russia, right? We did see the South African president saying that, this was, that the invasion itself was an unfortunate outcome of a failure on behalf of NATO not to listen to the concerns expressed by Putin, right? And that NATO hadn't heeded the cautions not to expand eastwards. We saw President Museveni of Uganda calling out the hypocrisy of the West and highlighting specifically NATO intervention in Libya as a concrete example of intervention. And I think for Africans, the disregard for the African Union's position on the intervention in Libya has left, a strong memory, right? Like they're not going to forget the fact that their position was not taken seriously, nor are they going to forget this kind of selective participation in the rule of law. And I think another element that's important here to kind of give more concrete a dimension to these votes is that we've seen the growing role and influence of a whole range of actors, not just China and Russia in Africa, but also of India, Turkey, and the Gulf states. And so the number of players that, each one of these states has to take into account in terms of the effects of these kinds of decisions at the UN are multiple, right? And you see the US just continuing to act, employing a patronizing tone with respect to African states. The ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, said that these states need to be taught and need to learn why the consequences of Russia's actions are so dire. And so just an explicit disregard for what it means for them to have to take into account their own needs and interests.
Noha Aboueldahab is an assistant professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, where she teaches public international law and transitional justice. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and a senior non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Given her expertise in the Middle East and North Africa, I asked Noha to evaluate the ways in which the countries of this region reacted to the conflict.
Yeah, so Middle Eastern governments are often reluctant to support the diplomatic isolation of a country, especially at an international or multilateral institution, right? Like many of the official statements coming out of governments in the Middle East underscored the need for diplomatic engagement and not isolation. So if you vote to kick another country out of the Human Rights Council, chances are that country, especially if it's a powerful one, will retaliate in one way or another, or indeed vote against you when you're in the spotlight for whether it's for an invasion or some other issue. And Russia pretty much made this clear in a letter that it sent to certain countries right before the Human Rights Council vote. And similarly, as we were just saying, many countries in the global south, including, of course, in the Middle East, cannot afford to suffer economic sanctions, right? Look at what's happened to Iraq. And so the reluctance to participate in economic sanctions against Russia comes from the same place. So I'm not an economics expert, but you can see how this has really resulted in a food crisis for really major countries like Egypt, for example, and so the reluctance and as I said, like even opposition to imposing these economic sanctions is very real. It's you can't. It's important to remember how such a food crisis can lead to even more conflict and more political opposition in these countries. They've done quite well in containing political opposition with the support of Russia and of course other countries, other powers. They don't want a food crisis to sort of destabilize that and cause another uprising or what have you. And so I think it has very real economic and political consequences, again, for huge countries, especially in Egypt. But also, of course, we have to remember the impact of the conflict on food security globally, and economic sanctions aren't exactly going to help that. And so the power and the significance of Russia, both politically and militarily, for several countries in the Middle East is enough to prevent them from taking an active position against it for its invasion of Ukraine. Russia is and can be an important ally for Middle Eastern governments, especially authoritarian ones who play the same counterterrorism card to oppress their political dissidents. They look and see how Russia successfully ensured the protection of the Assad regime in Syria. One day they might need Russia to do the same for them.
The countries of Latin America largely voted for the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. Brazil was among the few countries that abstained, and only a couple, including Bolivia, Cuba, and Nicaragua, voted against Russia's expulsion. In terms of economic sanctions, while some Latin American presidents, like the former Colombian president Iván Duque, expressed their potential support for this measure, most countries in the continent maintained their reluctance for applying them. Arlene Tickner is a professor of international relations at the School of International, Political, and Urban Studies at Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá, and co-director of the Colombian Observatory of Organized Crime. Her main areas of research include security in Latin America, Colombian foreign policy, critical social theory and international relations, and global South approaches to world politics. In addition to her academic work, Arlene publishes a weekly opinion column on various international topics in the Colombian newspaper El Espectador. Given her expertise in the continent, I asked her to elaborate more on the official response of Latin American countries to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Here's what she said.
Let me just say a few words about Colombia and the Duque government, which is clearly an outlier in all of this. Colombia has an atypical in terms of Latin America's international traditions, has an atypical tendency in history to align itself with the United States on different matters of its foreign policy, and the crisis in the Ukraine is no exception. The government of Iván Duque has essentially acted willingly. I call him as a soldier in the sanctions and in global critiques of Russia, speaking out even more forcefully than the United States or some governments of Western Europe within the United Nations. And this has been highly criticized within Colombia and within Latin America, because essentially what it means is that Duque has taken sides in this conflict overturning a very long-standing tradition in Latin America of trying not to take sides, in particular when two superpowers are involved in a confrontation, as what is happening nowadays between the United States and Russia. The reasons why Duque has done this, I think, are myriad, but there's two that I just wanted to throw out. One is his obsession with Venezuela and with the Maduro government in Venezuela. Russia is, and Putin in particular, is very committed to supporting the Maduro government and has sold a significant amount of equipment and weapons to Venezuela. And Duque has made use of this to criticize openly Russia's decision to invade the Ukraine. But it has much more to do, in my mind, with his attempts to counteract Maduro in Venezuela than actually with the Ukraine. And on the other hand, Duque is very keen, now that he is the outgoing president, to at least end his presidency on a high note in terms of his closeness to the Biden government in the United States. The relations have been tense, if not tense, maybe a strong word, distanced in some regards, given involvement of Duque's party, Centro Democrático, in the U.S. presidential elections in the state of Florida, where its participation on behalf of Trump and the Republicans was deemed a decisive factor in affecting the Democrats voting in the state of Florida. And so the Biden government, when elected, started punishing indirectly the Duque government, given this situation. And so he has been obsessed with ending his presidency with specific photo ops and gestures from the Biden administration that would point to the closeness of relations with Colombia on the part of the United States. So we can just set him aside because Duque is not indicative, I don't think at all, of what the region has done in terms of this war. So when thinking about Latin America in general, I think there's several traditions that are coming to the fore in explaining the different reactions of the majority of the region. Those countries that have sided with Russia are very few and are essentially Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba that have all received direct support from Putin. Brazil, has walked a fine line in terms of not committing openly to critiquing Putin. I think given, a longstanding tendency of non-alignment, but even more so in this case, given Brazil's trade relations with Russia and given Bolsonaro's own admiration of Putin. These are kind of two, populist autocratic types that, with a strong sense of their masculinity that identify personally with each other. And so that's how I would explain Brazil. In the rest of the region, the tradition of non-alignment, neutrality, and not taking sides is quite long-standing, as is the tradition, of insisting on peaceful, negotiated, diplomatic, multilateral solutions to different crises. And in addition to this, a long-standing defense of sovereignty and non-intervention. So the two of these combined kind of lend themselves to the region trying to side with the Ukrainian population and government in terms of condemning the invasion per se, but some governments have not even done this openly, but at the same time maintaining an adequate degree of independence and non-alignment that could be construed mistakenly as the region taking sides. And I think this is a legacy clearly from the Cold War and the need to maneuver between two powers, that on many occasions competed within the region in terms of, counteracting each country's respective sphere of influence. So this is something that I think on this occasion explains Latin America's position, and I think in many cases of the global South, the same tradition of defense of sovereignty, defense of non-intervention, but at the same time adherence to non-alignment and neutrality as appropriate tools of maneuvering internationally when large powers are in conflict in areas of the world that don't necessarily affect those countries directly is something that is also a longstanding tradition there. So that is essentially how I would explain this. Not applying sanctions and not being willing to send military assistance, I think is quite natural in the global South. The global South in general should not get involved in conflicts such as these. Basically because, well, first of all, most countries in the South are not in any condition to be sending military aid, nor should they be, because this would be essentially taking sides too. But also, the types of punishments that could be doled out afterwards, I think is something that plays heavily in these types of decisions. And so, and finally, just going back to Latin America, sorry to be a little disorganized, the same, in-betweenness of the region in distinct historical moments, in particular the Cold War, is something that, taking sides tends to aggravate. And so given the US's role in Latin America, not taking sides also opens up horizons of possibility for having, amicable relations, both with the United States, but also potentially with Russia or China or whoever. And so I think this notion of, in Spanish, we call it buena vecindad, good neighbors, is something that plays out too in Latin America's bids to not take sides, at least explicitly and emphatically.
Having understood the ways in which different regions in the global South responded to the conflict, I asked our guests what the implications of the Russia-Ukraine conflict are for the global South in general and for the regions or continents that each of them study specifically. For Samar Al-Bulushi, the main concern is the increasingly precarious position that African states and peoples are finding themselves in due to the shutdown of global supply chains. This war, she adds, has also brought about a drastic change in the geopolitical landscape for African countries.
So much of the continent relies heavily on wheat that is exported from Russia and Ukraine. And of course, these shipments have been disrupted since the onset of the conflict. In this context, the price of basic goods like oil and wheat has skyrocketed. And millions of people on the continent are now facing severe food shortages and in some cases famine. Now, we know that as part of the $40 billion aid package that was recently passed in Congress for Ukraine, there was $5 billion set aside within it for global food aid. And I'm interested in the question of how that food is going to be distributed. And will, for example, global South states, especially small states, have to compete with the US or whatever entity has now been tasked with gathering that food to then distribute? It could be the World Food Program, it could be USAID. Will small states have to compete with these massive entities themselves to gain access to the food that they need? And will states be forced to align themselves with US positions, whether it's with respect to Russia or other US interests, in order to gain access to that food aid? And finally, I think we have to recall that food aid itself has been used as the basis for military intervention in the past, and that was the case in Somalia in the 1990s. So it has all kinds of geopolitical implications, and I think demands that we raise a set of questions about how this food will be distributed, knowing how many people are going to be affected. There's another element that I want to highlight here that is a recent development that hasn't garnered that much attention yet, but has drastic geopolitical implications, and that is the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. This emerged in Congress at the end of March, and it passed overwhelmingly in the House. I think over 400 people voted yes, and at most 9 voted against it. So it has widespread support. And the act says that it will monitor Russian political engagement on the continent with the goal of, quote unquote, protecting African states from political interference, effectively by Russia. Now, they highlight, for example, the role of Russian mercenary groups as something of particular concern. And the way in which the US states that it's going to be combating this Russian influence is through the promotion, quote unquote, of democracy and the rule of law. Now, we've heard that line many times before, and I think this particular bill is incredibly alarming for what it represents in the form of making Africa the potential center of great power competition. Because at the end of the day, this is not simply about Russia. This has implications for China as well, and is fundamentally about the US ensuring that it can remain competitive on the continent. I would say that the emergence of this act in Congress is an indication that effectively this is how the US is going to be operating going forward. I am not aware of specific incidents in the past where that has been at play, but now we have it just presented to us so clearly, right? And some have been saying that this development represents a response and a form of punishment for the African states that did not vote to condemn Russia at the time of the invasion. I think that's kind of a short kind of term way to look at things, right? It has much longer term consequences. And, the more you read, both within the content of the act and with the accompanying analysis, there are two things. One is the just explicit demonization of Russia and the characterization of Russian activities, much like they've been doing with China, as somehow exceptional, right? And representing something fundamentally distinct from the kinds of activities that the US is engaging in on the continent and the motivations for those engagements, right? So the assumption is that the Russians and the Chinese have nefarious intentions, whereas the US is purely benign. And I do think that we are going to see the potential threat of financial consequences and the kind of you're either with us or against us approach.
Noha Aboueldahab highlighted the potential dangers of an increase in food and energy insecurity in the Middle East and discussed the ways in which the conflict has contributed to shifting the alliances of Middle Eastern countries towards a more multipolar world.
Well, I mean, food security and energy security are obviously two huge factors. I think those two have made many states in the Middle East and the rest of the global South, of course, vocal about their opposition to economic sanctions against Russia. This idea that bystander states, as the South African president called it, are suffering as a result of the sanctions against Russia and, obviously the domino effect of the global food security crisis. But, there's also a very strong consciousness of the power and influence that Russia wields geopolitically and globally. And so Middle Eastern governments are they tread carefully when reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine because of potential longer term consequences. But I think another issue is the opportunity that the Russia-Ukraine conflict has presented for certain governments in the Middle East. And indeed in other parts of the global South, right? This idea that Russia still represents a powerful counterforce to the US and its allies. And so by not taking an overly critical stance of Russia's invasion, by not isolating Russia, this is a message. It's also a message from certain governments in the Middle East to the US and to the West. We can afford to not go along with what you're doing, and we can still be okay. We can still exercise control over our sovereignty, over our decision making, and still be okay, sort of kind of like typical Cold War politics. And in other words, the world is actually more multipolar than the West would like it to be or would like to think that it is.
My last question for our guests had to do with those issues affecting the global South that have been largely omitted or ignored in the mainstream coverage of the conflict. According to Arlene Tickner, one of the main issues missing from the general discussion around the Russia-Ukraine war is Western interventionism. She also believes that there has been a media erasure of other humanitarian crises since the war in Ukraine broke out.
I'm going to speak, I think, essentially from a Latin American perspective, which may or may not be my own. I think one thing that's potentially missing from most analyses and discussions of the invasion and the war has to do with how we read different types of international intervention. And by this, I mean to say that if you look at the history, even the recent history of Western or Northern interventions in different parts of the world, it's very hard to argue that there are some interventions that might be construed as benevolent and others, such as the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that should be read as, violent, disrespectful of international law and whatnot. In my mind, no intervention is benevolent. And I think we tend to miss out on this point when reading the events in the Ukraine exclusively from the vantage point of Russia invading a sovereign country without any type of provocation, which is actually a fact. And yet, in most media coverages of this terrible event, we tend to forget that there have been a whole series of other interventions that, when conducted particularly by the West, have been represented as benevolent, as seeking out more worthy enterprises, such as the promotion of democracy, state strengthening, protection of civilian populations, and whatnot. So this is perhaps one blind spot in most reportings on the war, and I gather that in a more historical perspective, when there's a little more distance between events on the ground in the Ukraine and media analyses, political analyses, this is obviously going to come to the fore. Even when we talk about the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it's impossible to ignore how this may have set a precedent for Russia's own invasion of the Ukraine. So that would be kind of the first blind spot. The second, I think, has to do, and this has been a bit more visible in at least critical media coverages, the ways in which the humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine has tended to make invisible or less important myriad other humanitarian crises going on around the world. And just to name one, the Venezuelan population has been severely displaced given the situation within that country. Colombia, where I live, hosts today nearly 2 million Venezuelans. And yet, given now what's happening in the Ukraine, that the Ukrainian situation is now, tending to overcrowd and overshadow the different types of crises being experienced by migrant communities and refugee communities from other parts of the world. In the European context, for instance, it's quite clear how Ukrainian, migrants or refugees have been read differently as compared to people from Syria or elsewhere. And so I think this is something else that, again, critical media coverage has tended to make visible, but yet mainstream media has largely ignored. And it obviously lends itself to the question of, how the international community tends to make visible, to prioritize the needs of certain migrant communities or refugee communities, and to make invisible or less relevant the needs of others. And this is obviously a question that, theoretically speaking, we could approach from a post-colonial or a decolonial lens, of importance to thinking about the global from the South.
According to Samar Al-Bulushi, more attention should be paid to the issue of food insecurity, which she argues explains the emergence of a new form of politics in Africa, born from decades of crisis and repression.
Yeah, so I think the question of food is one that is going to have very, very clear consequences going forward. And To me, it is inevitable that the harder it is to access just basic goods and nutrition, the more likely it is that people will be taking to the streets. And we've already seen in the last 18 months 4 or 5 military coups on the African continent. And what's really important here, with the exception of Sudan, is that in many cases, those coups have been popularly celebrated. They have not been the topic of condemnation at the level of the street, right? At the diplomatic level, of course, everyone is rallying and saying, this is wrong, we have to restore democratic order. But on the street level, Amy Niang has written a piece that was first published in the Review of African Political Economy and then in Monthly Review. And her analysis of these coups and the reaction to them at the popular level is that we're starting to see a new form of politics emerge that is fundamentally, a response to and the product of desperation, right? So, I think that the masses, that the degree to which the masses are celebrating these coups, or at least accepting them, represents a response to the accumulated effects of decades of neoliberal policies that have only hurt, the everyday person. And so Amy Niang's analysis is that this suggests that we're going to see a new form of politics, and I think also that it forces us to think critically about the supposed separation between the civilian and the military realms. And as more and more of the global powers are investing in militarism as the solution, right, at the expense of social and economic needs and concerns, then it's, not so surprising. We shouldn't be so shocked when the people themselves similarly turn to a military solution.
And finally, Noha Aboueldahab raised some key questions to consider in future discussions surrounding the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
I think that, since we're discussing the Russia-Ukraine conflict from global South perspectives, one of the most important issues when it comes to the global South is this idea of transnational solidarity, right? So how does transnational solidarity look like right now? Has it changed? Do Ukrainian victims seek out alliances with victims from the global South? If not, why not? Or do global South movements seek out alliances with victims of the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Are there potential new spaces for such transnational solidarity that perhaps transcends racial differences? And speaking of victims and solidarity, what does the picture of a victim or a survivor look like right now? Has it changed or not? So I think that these are some important questions that literally have an impact on the daily lives of people, and it would be worth examining those more closely.
But the episode doesn't end here. After having talked to our guests, I decided to invite Security in Context co-founders Omar Dahi and Firat Demir to wrap up the conversation. Hi to both of you. I hope you're doing well. I'm going to go ahead and ask you the first question. So having listened to what our guests had to say on this matter, were there any specific points that resonated with you or that you think could be further developed? Or was there anything missing in the discussion that you would like to highlight, particularly since a lot of your research covers South-South relations? Omar?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, hi, Anita. Hi, Firat. It's good to be chatting with you guys today. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit how we came up with the idea of this episode. I mean, I think a lot of us were shocked and horrified by the invasion, which really was horrific in all sorts of ways. And it took us a while to recover and start processing what was happening. I mean, the project Security in Context was founded on the idea that, rejecting the idea that any country should be destroyed preemptively because of the security concerns of another country. And so after we started recovering and thinking about the shock from the invasion, we started also considering other issues and implications that were happening beyond the day-to-day destruction and the sort of tragedy of what was happening, both in terms of narratives that were emerging in the West, debates that were happening about the origins of the conflict. To what extent is this something that the West can be condemned for, things like the NATO expansion, versus sort of intrinsic factors that reflect sort of Russia's own foreign policy ambitions and the way it views itself and its relationship to the Ukraine. So there was a lot of debates happening in the West, but we also saw a lot of things that were missing, that were not being discussed, particularly things that are important for security in context, which is perspectives and implications and dynamics that affect the global South. And this is usually absent in Western media in the best of times, but particularly with the Ukraine conflict, there was quite a bit of focus on perspectives emanating from the US national security establishment, of course, European national security or sort of European security establishments as well. And so there was less attention to issues and implications from the global South, which particularly struck people as surprising when, for example, we saw votes in the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council where a significant number of global South countries abstained or didn't vote in the way that the US and Europe wanted them to vote. So there was lots of aspects that we wanted to sort of untangle and process a little bit more through the episode and with our guests. Some of it has to do with, and this has been commented on before, but the heavy dose of Western exceptionalism that permeated the coverage of the crisis that seemed to basically place the Russian invasion beyond the norms of what Western countries, particularly the United States, has done and has been doing for the past decades. So there was this question of Western exceptionalism that was then countered by a non-Western exceptionalism, which tried to, in my opinion, whitewash the actions of Russia and so forth. So how do we sort of think about this dynamic or this binary and think through it from a perspective that is sympathetic to social justice, sympathetic to victims of the invasion, but also doesn't try to exceptionalize what's happening as part of wider global processes. Lots of our guests invoked issues related to the particular dynamics and concerns of different developing countries, and perhaps we can get into that in the discussion today.
What are your thoughts, Firat?
I do agree that the current situation is quite complicated, and the global South is not a monolithic, uniform group. It's not homogeneous, definitely. And we need to talk about perspectives. The same with the global North. But I think one thing that struck me the most, given that I was quite close region-wise to the conflict during the first half of this 2022 as a Fulbright Fellow in Lithuania, and I could follow very closely the reactions of the people, both in the run-up to the war and also after the invasion, the general panic that people had and felt. For example, iodine tablets in the pharmacies were run out, and I had colleagues calling and telling me, "Fred, in case you need it, we have it." But also there was this reaction in the news media in Europe, particularly, and the United States, that how can such a thing happen in 2022? That portrayed this as a new event that has never happened, and definitely never happened as aggressors from the Western point of view. And it was especially and particularly interesting to follow the developments from within Lithuania, which went through Russian invasion together with the two other Baltic states of Latvia and Estonia in 1945. So there are still very fresh memories of Russian invasion in Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe. So there's that on the one hand, the fresh feelings and memories of people that happened under Russian invasion, and they could definitely connect with the experience Ukrainians were going through. But then on the other hand, there was this denial of other invasions and aggressions done either through their country's involvement directly. For example, the Iraq War, Ukraine sent soldiers directly to Iraq invasion. So did the three Baltic states. And when people were confronted with that experience and what that, it was not perhaps that much different regarding aggression and the justified claim that this is for preemptive strike to prevent another sovereign country from attacking and defending their own national interests, there was a disconnect. People really could not explain and justify. The closest that they could come up with was the historical experience and common past, either under Soviet Union or under the Warsaw Pact, because not all Central, East, and Northern Europe were under the Soviet Union, but they were satellites, like from Poland, for example. And another thing perhaps we can discuss later on more was the treatment of the human cost, the human element. Because at the time I arrived in Lithuania, there was a refugee crisis coming from mostly northern Iraq by people who were displaced from the invasion of Iraq, but also following Syrian civil war and so on. And some were economic refugees, some were humanitarian refugees. And if you remember the Syrian civil war and millions of refugees that were coming to Europe through Turkey, the reactions of countries such as Poland and others that were very negative, that did not want to share any of the burden the countries Italy and Greece were going through, or Turkey. But suddenly the refugees from Ukraine were welcomed with open arms. Unfortunately, the reported news on the media were quite disappointing, even on that account, that there were reports that your skin color was a bigger factor in welcoming you, even from Ukraine. And not everybody were welcome to those neighboring countries or otherwise from Ukraine.
Another question that I had for you is, well, all four of our guests pointed out that most global South countries have preferred not to take sides in the conflict, or have tried to refrain from taking actions that could harm their relationship with Russia. But would you say that there have been any salient differences in the way that each region, so Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, etc., in the ways that they have responded to the conflict? And in which ways do you think that this war could reconfigure transnational solidarity dynamics?
Yeah, this is something that came up in the different responses of our guests. And I think, as Firat said, the global South is not homogeneous. So we're trying to, in this episode, sort of tease out what are the different regional specific dynamics. And even within those regions, there are differences across countries. And I think Professor Arlene Tickner mentioned how, Colombia, for example, which is a country that has historically had very close ties to the U.S. national security state and sort of army and military and security ties, longstanding, has under the previous administration, the Duque administration, really gone out of its way to support the Western narrative. But even there, they're viewing it through the regional lens of, for example, their opposition to the Venezuelan government. So there are always ways in which the global South countries, and this is something that's often misunderstood, is that they're also responding to their priorities, their concerns, whether these concerns are things that are global in nature, but different from Western security concerns. For example, food security, which is something that all of our guests talked about, which is going to be a really serious issue moving forward. That's the priority of global South countries. Right now, for many Western countries, that's not the priority that they might be lending lip service to it. So there's that element of it. But I think despite these differences, there are common denominators. And the common denominator that has come out is that, quite simply, most global South countries see this as a Western conflict against Russia. They don't view it necessarily through the lens that of something that they have to condemn, or that they have to sign up fully to the Western agenda in isolating Russia and in bankrupting Russia, which is increasingly what is coming out, especially with the sanctions and so on. And I think Noha Aboueldahab mentioned that, for example, many Middle Eastern states are reluctant to sign on to any political campaign that completely isolates any country, let alone a major country like Russia, not just because of the current material interests that they have with Russia, but also they don't want this to happen to them in the future. So I think the dynamics that come out is very much an awareness and weariness of signing up to to fully subscribing to the US-led response to the Russian invasion. And this comes out particularly in Africa, for example, these dynamics where, and we actually in the panel that we did in March 12th of this year with Professor Michael Clare, Bob Vitalis, Emily Meyerding, we talked about the geopolitics of oil. And one of the things that Michael Clare brought out is the increasing way in which this conflict is going to be used through the lens of great power competition. And the US is going to instrumentalize the conflict to force global South countries to choose, you're either with us or you're with China and Russia. And perhaps the China role is going to become more apparent, actually. The real target of the US national security state eventually is China, not Russia. And so Samar brought up the Countering Russian Malign Activities in Africa Act, which is already being drafted and which can potentially force developing countries in Africa to choose sides if they want aid or if they want basically further cooperation with the West. So you can see how there's a real rejection of this conflict being instrumentalized to force the global South countries to pick sides and to essentially be pawns in this great power competition conflict.
Firat.
To follow up on that, I'm definitely, even from within the same regions, there's significant differences across countries. And when right after the invasion, one of the major Western European news agency, for example, was portraying the conflict as this is the first time since Second World War a major European city is being bombed, which was not correct. Belgrade was bombed, Sarajevo was bombed. If you just focus even on Europe, and they are more Western European than Kiev, that doesn't change the fact of the brutality of the invasion. But even within Europe, if you look at Western and Eastern Balkans, they have significant differences, or even countries like Hungary have significant differences than Poland. And within the global South, if we define it in a very broad terms, which would include some of the European countries as well, if you take the Middle Eastern countries or Central and Western Asian countries, there are significant differences across the board. And some of them are trying to have this delicate balance. Take Turkey, for example. Turkey has significant trade relationships and security partnerships with both Ukraine and Russia. On the one hand, they are selling unmanned airplanes to the so-called Bayraktar planes to Ukraine, even donating some of them. And at the same time, having significant trade relations with Russia and Ukraine. Wheat and grain imports from both countries are significant, but also natural gas. Turkey is significantly dependent on Russian natural gas flows, as well as security concerns from Turkish perspective in Middle East that differ from the US perspectives regarding their own security priorities. Africa is not any different. Asia is not either. And I think one major concern within the global South is bringing China into the equation. And my reading of it is that Chinese leadership is trying to limit their involvement. And I don't think they are approving what Russia did. I think they were not expecting it as much as others. But the use of the Russian invasion and trying to create a new axis of evil, including Russia and China in the equation, is really worrisome and concerning for all countries, not just those in the South. A new Cold War is, I would like to say, starting, unfortunately, but I think has already started with the expansion of NATO further to Sweden and Finland, countries which Sweden stayed neutral for more than 100 years. Finland had major wars and lost land to Russia, but other than that, had peaceful relations with Russia. And that further expansion, I think, is not going to help with the situation, definitely. And we have other countries on the list, from Ukraine to Georgia, that might be a recipe for further conflict. On top of that, you have the administration of Russia, which to me has really little control or understanding of the situation on the ground, like any other dictatorship. And Russia is what it is to me. The leadership of the country has little understanding of the problem, and the top administration are stuffed with people who are not merit-based, but based on connections and yes men. And Putin's display of justification of the war was a very clear example of it. And this is a country with thousands of warheads, nuclear warheads. So that's really scary. And the Global South can play a balancing role here, including China, and I think the best that could happen would be for Western Europe and the US to find a way to bring China into a more neutral position rather than demonizing and creating a new Cold War with Russia and China on the one hand, and then either you are with us or against us. And invasion of Baghdad and bombing of Baghdad is in none of the discussions here. Right? If you look at the human cost of invasion of Ukraine, it is humongous in terms of physical infrastructure, but also human cost. And I don't like comparing human lives. One life is one too many. But we are talking about millions of lives that are lost in invasion of Iraq. And then you are looking at a country like Syria, where almost half, if not more, of the country has been displaced, either internally or externally. We are talking about next 50, 60 years of this country is lost. Iraq still doesn't have 24-hour electricity in a given day. And nobody's talking about rebuilding it. And Afghanistan is also there. Where the Western troops have withdrawn and women don't even have the right to go to school anymore, despite 20 years of promises. On top of that, now we have the Ukrainian invasion, and the biggest concern people are raising is how can this happen today? Well, it has been happening for the last century, almost every decade. We have a major conflict.
Yeah, it's all very true. I mean, we did a really good episode. Our first episode of the Security in Context podcast was about Afghanistan, and I think it's always interesting to go back to that discussion as well, from the perspective of what's happening now, especially with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I wanted to ask you both if there are any concluding remarks that you like to share. We're running out of time, so if there's any further issues that you'd like to bring up, now's the time.
Thanks, Anita. Yeah, I mean, we wanted to keep this short, but just to conclude, I mean, I wanted to thank Firat and you for doing this today. And one thing I wanted to point out is one of the common denominators is this question of non-alignment. And Firat and I have done a lot of work. I mean, our book was about comparing the past and present of South-South relations. And ways in which it was considered a positive alternative for North-South relations, how relations among developing countries can really bring about alternative and more positive economic, political, social outcomes. And I think this question is now returning to the fore, because on the one hand, we see what the Western dynamic is pushing for, which is also something that we reject. And as we talked about today, this sort of forcing countries into a corner. On the other hand, as we've shown, the rise of China and their economic influence has really ambiguous effects, to say the least. In some ways, it can be positive. In some ways, it can be highly negative and create highly uneven outcomes in the same way that replicates North-South dynamics. So I think it's something to look out for, and something we'll be revisiting more and more is lots of the rest of the global South. If we take China as one of the big powers now, the rest of the global South really wants to be non-aligned and try to play off or benefit from both sides rather than be forced into a corner. And the question is, to what extent will they be able to do that?
I fully agree, but there's also the aspect of this playing, I think Global North has been doing also. I think we should stop thinking that the security concerns, however legitimate it is for one country or for one nation or for one group of people, at the expense of another, is not the way to go. The expansion of two additional NATO members, if that means losing the security promises given, for example, to a large ethnic group like Kurds, to satisfy the security concerns of those in Finland and Sweden, that is really on principle. It's not following the principles that they claim to be following, like if you look at the founding principles of European Union, at least on paper. And then in order to be able to join NATO so that these countries have security assurances against Russian expansionism. But then if that means we have to give up very legitimate concerns of another ethnic group, that it really doesn't fix the problem. This is a zero-sum game. And we need to be able to find a way of bringing this out of zero-sum game so that it becomes win-win for all sides. And non-aligned movement, not just for the South, but for the North, I think is the way to go. And also start seeing that these are really complicated issues. And what global power competition does, or what real politics, the so-called at the nation state level, it should be different than at the people's level. People on the ground, on the streets, should be able to understand and relate very legitimate concerns and experiences people are going through. And no less in Europe. Every country in Europe went through a refugee crisis, either from within themselves. Take Germany, a significant number of them have become refugees. Take Baltic states, a significant number, up to a third of these countries were refugees, displaced after invasion by Russia or other forces. And when another country goes through a similar experience, rather than saying this is not my problem or demonize one group of people without addressing the real issues, is not going to make it right or better, but instead helps reproduce the same type of conflicts going forward.
You were just listening to Eric Draitser, Samar Al-Bulushi, Noha Aboueldahab, Arlene Tickner, Omar Dahi, and Firat Demir. Thank you for listening to the Security in Context podcast. Security in Context is a transnational research initiative aimed at envisioning a world in which security is defined not by militarism and fear, but by human well-being, global solidarity, and a livable planet. Our team of international scholars foregrounds the needs of societies over states to demonstrate why rethinking military and security policy is key to addressing the world's most pressing problems, including global inequalities and environmental injustice. Follow us on Twitter or check out our website to stay up to date with our events, publications, videos, and more.